And we're recording. Hi, Victor. How are you?
Hello. Good. Thanks for having me back on.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, so I think we can kind of pick up some of the threads from our last conversation, but moving in a slightly different direction. I've been reading a lot of so-called anarcho-primitivist writing or green anarchy. And I think that what I want to do is explore a little bit of the implications for this line of thinking when it comes to herbal medicine and so-called holistic medicine in general. Um, and I think maybe I'm just going to start with one line from John Zerzan, who's a anti-civilization guru of sorts, you could say, who is based out of Eugene, Oregon, and has written a number of very provocative books. So this line, it reads, "To assert that we can be whole, enlightened, healed within the present madness amounts to endorsing the madness." And I read this line and I thought to myself, this has implications for so many domains of human activity. It has implications for, obviously, medicine. It has implications for spiritual practices. It has implications for basically every practice where the aim is to arrive at some form of wholeness. And I think that what this line brings out is the importance of thinking in terms of a totality, thinking in terms of the implications of existing in a certain kind of techno system, such as we do. And yeah, so that's, I don't know if you have anything to say to that, but that's where I wanted to start, and using that as a kind of focal point for the rest of the conversation. I'll read the line again. "To assert that we can be whole, enlightened, healed within the present madness amounts to endorsing the madness."
Right, you're saying essentially, like, rather than examining the environmental implications, like our societal implications for why we're not feeling well, the onus is on us to fix ourselves and our routines and our lives in order to fit
Exactly.
within the madness.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And so we're dealing with, technopathocracy, which is basically means the rule of sick machines. And so we can talk about, exactly what that entails. What does it mean to say that a machine is sick? And how does the sickness of a machine affect the patterns of illness or the patterns of disease amongst human populations that are forced to exist within that system, that mechanic system? But what this line is also saying is that, wholeness can't be attained under conditions that actively work to reduce the individual to a state of meaninglessness.
Mm.
And we can't pretend that genuine health and genuine well-being are a possibility under such conditions. And so, to assert that we can be whole, enlightened, healed within the present madness amounts to endorsing the madness. Well, why does it amount to endorsing the madness? Right? Because isn't all, these spiritual practices and these holistic health practices that just try and get people back to an optimal condition, how is that endorsing the madness if they're fundamentally concerned with individual well-being? Well, it's endorsing the madness because implicitly it's a justification for the continued existence of a system that makes us all sick. So if you can work with someone who is sick because of severe social repression, and you're able to tweak their system so that they're able to function again and re-expose them back to the same conditions that got them sick in the first place, well then yeah, of course that's endorsing the system, because it's like, the car breaks down because you're driving it too quickly or you're putting the wrong kind of gas in it, and you keep doing the same thing, and you bring it to the shop, put the same kind of gasoline in, it's like, well, it's not going to, in the long term, it's not going to work. It's not a solution.
And essentially you're asking your mechanic, why is my car not working with the wrong gas? Can you fix the
Yeah,
car
yeah,
so it can function under the conditions that it's not meant to function under?
exactly. So, when I read this line, it had a lot of radical implications, because obviously, I'm very concerned with helping individuals meet their health needs. But, there are some cases in which it's like, well, I can really help this person, but there are factors beyond even the best healer's control.
Mm.
And this is where healing intersects with the political question, the political problem, because we can't ignore these contexts and these circumstances and these scenarios.
I was listening to, sorry, just one quick, I was listening to this this panel actually of psychiatrists of all people. They were discussing like wellness, which was very interesting to me. And they were, and it was actually kind of open-minded of them. It was an interesting discussion. They were talking about burnout, which is this thrown around term, right? Which is, maybe approximates what you're describing, and their distinction between, because the symptoms of burnout and the symptoms of something like, dysthymia or mild depression are essentially the same. But their distinction between burnout and depression was that burnout was an environmental problem. So it's related to work, essentially. And so they were like, well, so the solution for burnout is not in necessarily like fixing the pathology within the individual, but within the workplace. But of course, they're not taking it as far as Zerzan or you were saying to take it. Like their ideas, like, we have these workplace wellness programs where you're meditating at lunchtime and, and these different things like that. But essentially it's this idea. Yeah. It's like, a sick machine.
Yeah. That's the thing. And even people that, on the left, for example, who hold radical political views, when you start talking to them about the abolition of work, they think you're totally nuts. But this idea isn't anything new. And the ancient Greeks, their word for work was ponos, and it has the same roots as the Latin poena, which means suffering. And so for them, the work was a curse. It was a curse, and there was no way of possibly redeeming work. And to propose this idea to people that we have to move towards a social situation in which their work is not a normal part of our daily living. It's inconceivable and incomprehensible, and you're dismissed as a lunatic. But when you get into thinking in terms of the paradigm of green anarchy and anarcho-primitivism, it becomes not only a seemingly good idea, but the only possible idea for a sustainable future. And so, yeah, we're not going to. We could do a whole podcast on the implications of work, but let's talk about more about what we were talking about to start this podcast.
Can you define green anarchy for us?
Green anarchy is essentially, anarchy, the most common and widely accepted definition is a state of self-rule or self-autonomy and self-governance. But green anarchy basically is more vocal in its rejection of a technological system that basically imposes a certain kind of world through the technological structures that are created. And so, okay, what does this mean? We can think of certain examples, right? Let's think of the car as an example. As soon as the car comes into existence, the whole landscape changes. The whole landscape in terms of, well, now a big segment of the world is paved over. Cities are designed and towns are designed even for people who have cars, and you can't live certain places if you don't have a car. Another example is the cell phone. I mean, there's so many implications of the cell phone. One of which is just this incessant demand that now is imposed upon people that they be able to receive calls and answer emails and text messages at any hour of the day, wherever they are. And the list goes on. But basically, green anarchy, you could say, starts from this premise that technology is not morally neutral. There are imperatives that are contained within every piece of technology that we use as a species. And we've reached the point now where these moral imperatives are being imposed from not from a necessity of our human life world, but from a artificial system that's been created. Mm-hmm. And this artificial system has essentially taken on its own momentum, taken on its own life, taken on its own power that now is dictating to human beings how they should live. So Green Anarchy says we have to reject this imposition. And, you know, it's not being against technology as such, because where does technology begin, right? So, you know, like stone tools are technology, but the Green Anarchists are not saying to reject, you know, so-called primitive technology, because that technology emerges as a result of the necessities of the human life world. And those are also technologies that are being created by people, right? I don't know anyone who knows how to build a computer. I don't know anyone who knows how to build a car. And the thing is that these technologies are becoming more and more complex. You know, 60 years ago, it wasn't uncommon for people who drove cars to be able to fix them. But now we have a technological system that not only do the technologies last, you know, a much shorter period of time before breaking down, but they're also so overly complex that no one knows how to fix them except for designated experts.
So we're just told to buy new ones when ours break down.
Yeah, exactly. So this is just one piece of what Green Anarchy is, but Green Anarchy also has, you could say, a spiritual dimension, which we can talk about now. And, you know, Zerzan, when he talks about medicine, he says that medicine is basically the restoration of what belongs to nature. And I think that's a very beautiful and very profound definition of medicine and of healing, the restoration of what belongs to nature. And so this entails removing whatever works against life's capacity to renew itself.
Yeah, we talk about the vis medicatrix naturae, the healing force of nature in naturopathic medicine. That's the base principle of the medicine we practice, which is this idea that we all contain an inherent blueprint for optimal health, and that if we are not in an optimal healthy state, then there's something in the way, some sort of obstacle to us realizing that blueprint.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same principle. And so from there, Zerzan says that the spirit of anarchy is very similar. And I'm quoting here, he says, remove what blocks our way, and it's all there waiting for us. So, you know, anarchy and holistic medicine have the same fundamental principle. Yeah, remove the obstacle, return or restore what belongs to nature, and you know, then you're able to have life renew itself again. Once you remove the obstacles, you're able to renew the individual body, and you're able to renew the social and collective body when the false political structures of the technopathocracy are abolished. So that's, you know, that's the fundamental principle of Green Anarchy and its relation to medicine. I'll read a bit more from Zerzan, where he's talking about authentic spirituality. So he says, authentic spirituality is so importantly a function of our connection with the earth. To reclaim the former, we must regain the latter. So that is, to reclaim spirituality, we need to reestablish a genuine connection with the earth. That so very much stands in our way as the measure of how bereft we have become. Do we have the imagination, strength, and determination to recover the wholeness that once was our human birthright? And so this is the challenge. This is the challenge of Green Anarchy.
I think you were mentioning the other day about how modern spiritual practices are I believe you said something about a response to, or like a Band-Aid solution, essentially, for making up for this base lack that we have in meeting our natural needs. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, that goes into you know, this question of, you know, philosophy as a kind of homesickness, right? And yeah, so this is coming from Novalis, the German philosopher poet, and he called philosophy a kind of homesickness, which is basically reminding us that there is a lost unity of the world and a lost unity of nature, and much of what takes place under the realm of symbolic culture is a way of trying to restore this longing for paradise, right? And, you know, the Garden of Eden is an archetype, right? It's an archetype. Paradise is an archetype that we have and that we're dealing with. And Green Anarchy is tapping into this, and it's saying, don't lose sight of that, because that's the way of actually arriving at this lost unity of the world that we're trying to reach, that we're trying to attain by means of all of these practices that that we're engaging in now, be it a spiritual practice, be it an artistic practice, whatever it is. And Green Anarchy doesn't say, oh, well, stop making art. It's like, no, obviously it doesn't. We're not. It's not a proposal to do away with these means, but to understand what it is that's motivating us to engage in these acts of symbolic culture.
Mm.
Why are we driven to do these kind of things? What is the longing that's underpinning them?
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm part of this 21-day meditation challenge, and the theme is abundance. And, it's obviously within the context of creating abundance within the modern world, right? In the way that we understand abundance, which is more money or whatever, more of whatever the thing is that you need to function better in society. And again, just, functioning better within the madness, as you're saying. So, whereas really, like, what is that longing for abundance or whatever? It's like you said, like this drive towards a greater interconnectivity or greater sense of wholeness, not just more money to buy more things, or it's not a complete, like, we're not resolving the longing in a complete way.
Yeah.
We're not taking it as far maybe as it needs to go.
Exactly.
In understanding our drive.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, and I think one of the things that herbal medicine can offer is a sense of what this lost unity feels like, right? So the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty said, nature is always for us as at the first day, right? So herbal medicine is a key, one of the keys to unlocking this sense of the unity of the natural world and our place in the natural world. It reawakens that felt sense of direct experience, and reawakens it reawakens the what I don't know what we can call it. Direct sensuous experience, the felt presence of immediate experience. And it does that because plants, that's what plants are. Plants are immersed in that world of timelessness, of eternity. And they always will be. They exist outside of time. And for Zerzan, time is the first trap. Time is the first I'll read here. He says, just as today's most obsessive notion is that of the material reality of time, self-existent time was the first lie of social life. As with nature, time did not exist before the individual became separate from it. Reification of this magnitude, the beginning of time, constitutes the fall, the initiation of alienation of history. So, that's a very powerful claim that that time and also nature didn't exist before the human species became separate from it.
Yeah. How did one exist within time, not as a separate entity from time? What does that look like? Like that's even hard for us to conceptualize or even understand.
That's the thing, because some of these claims that are being proposed in this paradigm of green anarchy are pointing to a mode of existence that is so far removed from us. I mean, we're not talking 2 generations. We're talking like many, many, many generations back. But, what does it mean? What does it mean to exist outside of time? Well, we can think, not going so far back to hunter-gatherer existence, but even back to the Industrial Revolution, where clocks were imposed for the first time. And so you had simultaneously the emergence of factories, the emergence of clock towers in the cities that were being constructed, coffee and sugar, all at the same time, right? And so you have people who didn't live with clocks. They basically organized their day through the sun and the course of the sun, and that was their time, right? And that's not inconceivable to us, right? So
like
there's
the natural impulse within, like, oh, it's time for me to sleep, it's time for me to eat.
Exactly. So that's one sense of timelessness that we can I think feel within ourselves, right? So they're still existing within a social structure. They still worked, right? They're still artisans and craftspeople, but their work had, meaning, and it was driven by a kind of sense of autonomy and freedom. And then the factory system came in, and there was great opposition. People don't often think of this history of the Luddites and so on, who were a group of people who basically saw that their freedoms were being taken away, that they were being forced into factories that de-skilled them. There was a massive de-skilling of society. There was a massive basically handover of power into a kind of elite, which it kept becoming more and more and more narrow in terms of where this centralization of power was taking place. And the Luddites basically said, the same thing that Zerzan is saying, is that we recognize that there is a moral implication in all of these technologies. There's a moral and social implication. And we won't stand for it. We're not going to take it. And so the Luddites destroyed the technology that they understood to be harmful to the common good. And, there's not any, Green Anarchy is basically the only kind of philosophical Luddite movement that exists today, because people think you're crazy if you say, well, we have to do away with computers. But, I think that hypothetically, if that were to be the case, I think if most people sat down and actually thought about the implications of that, because I think everyone who's lived basically at a time before computers and a time after computers would say that they have felt more connected to the people in their lives that they care about before the imposition of computers and cell phones than after, And sure, you can talk to someone off in Australia, but it's for all the claims about how technology makes us more connected, there's more alienation, more loneliness, more depression, more despair as a result of the use of these technologies. I mean, that's not even debatable at this point.
Right. And like you said with, it was interesting earlier on in this conversation, you're saying that there's this moral impetus, there's this agenda behind the creation of these technologies. They're not fulfilling necessarily a need. It's even with a tool, like if I put a hammer in your hand, you're going to be compelled to bang something with it probably, or put it down. There's really two options if I give you a hammer, So, and so, like a lot of these technologies, we were talking about this before too. It's like, you can take your cell phone and use it to call people or to fulfill a need that you have, a need that's been imposed by our society and how addicted we are to these screens and technology. But there are people that will like sort of investigate their phones to just uncover what else it offers. It's like, so whoever is creating this phone is also creating needs within a person that need to be fulfilled. Like, oh, now I can, take a selfie of myself and sort of optimize my aesthetic presence online. And there's this whole need.
Exactly. And this goes back to our earlier discussion of the unlawful image.
Right.
That's what it is. That's what it is. And it's perpetuated by this technological system. And people can't cope with it, right? So, if we look at the rate at which drug abuse and addiction have gone up over the past 30 years, it's skyrocketed. It's skyrocketed, and it keeps going up. It keeps going up and up and up and up. And there's always more things to become addicted to.
Yeah. And we see the implications for attention and focus and an immersion in tasks. I've noticed a change in my own brain in terms of being able to read a book or to focus on certain things or to dedicate myself to something, an artistic project or an endeavor.
This is the thing. And there was a national survey done in the United States, and 1 out of every 3 people said that they have felt close to a nervous breakdown at some point. 1 out of 3, like nervous breakdown is a serious thing, and 1 out of 3 people felt close to one. And
they're diagnosed with anxiety or panic disorder, and essentially blamed for it, or, a brain imbalance perhaps is blamed for it, or the genetic predisposition is blamed for it, and not the societal madness.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we have a multiplication of healing modalities and alternative therapies and so on and so on. And these therapies are growing in proportion to basically the denial of the root cause of suffering estrangement, alienation, repression.
Mm. It's like we're sort of patching people up to get back in the game.
Yeah, yeah. And what's the consequence? Well, I'm going to read from Zerzan. He says, meanwhile, afflictions such as chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia debilitate many. No specific cause can be found. It is as if a growing number of people are simply becoming allergic to society itself.
And these people are told that they're imagining it, or that there's something sort of, maybe they're blamed, it's being chalked up to being maladapted. Like, oh, it's just a sensitive person, a highly sensitive person, or empathic person. These people are sort of cast as outliers, or as, people with very specific needs, rather than people that are just attuned to all human needs, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And what's the mainstream medical approach? Well, to give antidepressants and various classes of pharmaceutical drugs, which now have become so pervasive that they constitute a significant source of pollution and an unbelievable source of contamination of the water and the soil. And so maybe we can talk a bit about that, because I think it's an interesting problem. This contamination from psychotropic drugs. So we hear discussions about how it's difficult for individuals to wean off of these drugs, and things about how they affect the individual person. But we don't hear very much about the implications that they have on the ecosystem.
Or how some of us may inadvertently be taking them through the water supply.
Yeah, well, we all are. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about that now. Let's see here. So for decades now, there have been basically countless millions of pounds of over 50 pharmaceutical forms of serotonin reuptake inhibitors excreted and dumped into water supplies and waste sites all around the world. And so when we're operating with a kind of mechanomorphic universe as machine perspective, it's easy to unquestioningly assume that SRIs and SSRIs are an exclusively human problem, and lose sight of the reality. And here I'm quoting from Stephen Herod-Buhner. He says that these inhibitors affect all organisms that use serotonin in their functioning. It's basically everything.
Yeah, all social animals. And serotonin is, I believe, like every single neuron uses serotonin in some way. It's like in every single neural impulse, there's serotonin implicated. It's not just the happy hormone as we've depicted it. It modulates other neurotransmitters and other hormones. It's important for digestion. It does a variety of different things in the brain, and these medications are targeted, for one specific purpose, which is essentially to decrease a depression rating scale score.
Yeah, without any thought of the ecological implications. I mean, personal implications are considered, but the ecological implications are just not discussed. So yeah, Stephen Buhner has done a lot of work on this, and it's I think very important. I want to read another line from Buhner. He basically demonstrates that serotonin affects a countless number of biological systems in innumerable plant and animal organisms, and he says what's affected in these beings are things such as sexual maturation, reproduction, germination, root and brain development. In short, the function of every system that serotonin affects throughout the Earth system. So yeah, plants and animals. And so as a result, these systems are becoming more and more damaged and compromised. And SRIs and SSRIs do not have to be present in large amounts for them to be active, or for them to adversely affect the functioning of an organism in one way or another. Right. So Buhner points out that
10 milligrams sometimes as a therapeutic dose.
Yeah, so he points out that these compounds are potent and active in trace amounts, and quite distressingly, he observes that they can be found in all wastewater streams in industrial nations. And he continues, these drugs slow development of all the species that encounter them, affect the reproductive health, and slow the response of their neural system to external stressors. So this problem is here to stay, because once SRIs and SSRIs degrade in streams and are reduced to sediment at the bottom of bodies of water, they show no signs of biodegrading at all. No signs of biodegrading. Like, we're not saying like, oh, in 100 years they'll be gone. No, in 100 years they're still going to be there.
Right, so they're excreted through the urine of animals that are taking them, so essentially humans, and then they just exist within the environment. So we're sort of creating them in a lab and then putting them into the environment. And it's interesting actually. So like the serotonin, so psychedelic medicine works on serotonin as well, but a different receptor from the SSRI. And there are different, one person, a man called Robert Carhart Harris, did an experiment to figure out, you know, what are those serotonin receptors involved in? So the psychedelics tend to activate a responsive coping system where somebody's looking for new solutions. And the SSRI is more of an adaptive coping system where it's like you're more accepting of your external circumstances, whether those circumstances are pathological or not.
Mm.
Again, it's more of that like, okay, we've patched you up so you can get back into the soccer game kind of thing.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's a very interesting topic, and yeah, you know, and I it's like it's touchy for some people to talk about this because, you know, there are so many people that are now dependent on this class of drugs, right? And, you know, from the perspective of Green Anarchy, I mean, the blame is not to be placed on these people that are taking the drugs, right? I mean, it's like they've become, as we were saying, allergic to society itself.
And yeah, so you're gonna take any solution that works for you, right? So yeah,
that's the thing. So yeah,
yeah. There's a, you know, it has to be really parsed out, this topic, because any mention of or any sort of criticism of the psychiatric medications is often met with, well, you're shaming medication use, and that's not the goal of these discussions. It's more to have a realistic conversation around what are these drugs actually doing from a pharmacological perspective. What are they doing to the environment? What are they doing in our brains? And it's not like don't take them if they're of use to you, but it's a deeper examination of what role are they playing in our mental health, and are they creating mental health and wellness, right? Or are they just helping us manage a mental illness, essentially?
Yeah.
And these are different things, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe we can talk about some potential herbs that can be used.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about how herbs exist outside of time, or you know, like, you know, and how they're a solution? Actually, and I have another, I want to also talk about, you know, drugs versus plants, because this is a conversation we had a few days ago, looking at the stars and having a conversation around, you know, that they actually work very distinctly.
That what, sorry?
Well, so, I mean, drugs are typically like have a linear goal, right? So we have these linear logical systems within conventional medicine where we examine two variables, right? So if I give you this medication, what's the outcome? So it's X and Y, right? And so you're looking at two variables in science, and then you're controlling for those two variables, and you're trying to eliminate all the other potential pollutants of looking at like this cause and effect relationship. So you give a drug and you get an outcome. And so, you know, so the drugs are typically targeted. They create one physiological response, and they can override our entire physiology to gain an outcome. They're powerful. And then you have a plant that works in more of a network. And there's something called modulation in herbal medicine that doesn't really exist inside the conventional system. So we talk about, like, you know, with herbs, it's like, oh, echinacea, you shouldn't take if you have an autoimmune disease because it stimulates the immune system. Whereas echinacea and other plants are immunomodulators more than immunostimulants. And so if your immune system's already hyperactive, it has the effect of balancing out an imbalanced response. So, you know, that doesn't really exist in the realm of conventional drugs, where an herb can kind of get in and communicate with these hormonal systems in the body and almost smooth things out, or regulate these natural responses.
Exactly. And this is because every human, like every plant and animal, is one of the infinitely many neurons in the nervous system of Gaia.
Right.
That's the explanation. Say more about that. Well, I mean, yeah, you know, basically, like, you know, you can even look at the roots. You know, there's these various graphics that go around the internet of like the root system of a tree and the nervous system of a human being, and they look very, very, very similar, right? And the form. I think we talked a little bit about this in the first episode, but you know, every force evolves a form, and so, you know, the same forces that went into producing the root structure probably were used by the Gaian mind to shape and craft elements of the human nervous system. And, as Goethe points out, the root system of the tree is basically the tree's brain.
Mm.
It's like the human being upside down.
Mm.
So yeah, we see these correspondences all throughout the natural world. So that's what it means, that plants and animals and human beings are just one of the infinitely many neurons in the nervous system of Gaia.
Mm.
Fundamentally, when you get down to it, there's no possibility of separating out, making clear-cut divisions, because as is obvious to anyone, what happens when you remove a species from an ecosystem? Well, that has implications for every other organism that exists in that ecosystem. Some might be slightly more effective than others, but it has radical implications. And this is a topic that has come up recently over the conversation of invasive plants, so-called invasive plants, right? Well, invasive plants seemingly are causing all kinds of damage, damage to property, for one thing, which, from a green anarchy perspective, is like, well, forget that. I mean, that has no relevance, no significance. But yeah, there are some plants like garlic mustard, for example, which can starve out and actively deprive nutrients for other native plants that are growing in the same environment. But then we see, when we look at how garlic mustard is functioning long term, that when you give it enough time, it actually works to rebuild the strength of the soil. And so, we can think that we understand what's going on, and say, oh, well, we have to pull this plant out, we have to remove this. Well, why is the natural system that we exist in letting it happen, letting garlic mustard take over?
Right.
And if you walk around Hyde Park, there's like tons of garlic mustard growing there. It's like, why is that happening?
It's like what, if we don't intervene, does the world just become all garlic mustard, right? Like we're not trusting in the intuitive, the wisdom of nature itself, right? To balance itself out, extremes. Actually, so when you're talking about, so essentially the doctrine of signatures, which that is that, a plant's, there's this mimicry in nature of certain systems. So you're talking about, the roots or branch systems of a plant, and our nervous system, like our neurons, and how they branch out. Our vascular system does the same thing. Riverbeds do the same thing, and then we mimic that technology. Let's say in like wires, wire systems, electrical systems in one's house, plumbing, like sewer systems. So there's this like, it's hard to even understand. So it's like, what other way would there be to spread or communicate some sort of information or some sort of substance around, right? That's, but this branching system is something that was created by nature, that nature evolved.
Yeah. And that's, in the Hermetic tradition, they would say as above, so below, right? In the Taoist tradition, as in the macrocosm, so in the microcosm. That's a fundamental law of nature. And and this is what Green Anarchy is about. It's like, well, our social systems have to operate and have to be designed around the laws of nature, following the laws of nature. So yeah, okay, let's talk a little bit about one herb that I think should be more widely known. It's Albizia. So Albizia is used primarily in Chinese medicine, but I use a lot in my practice, and it's a remedy for unshakable depression, melancholia, severe loss, brokenheartedness, anxiety, chronic grief. And it's especially well indicated when these are conditions that the individual just can't shake. So it's like long-standing grief, long-standing depression, long-standing loss, that it's just like this heartache that won't go away. So Albizia helps us to process difficult emotions that we are resistant or otherwise unable to work through. And it can make us aware of the underlying contours of our psychical and emotional landscape and gently show us a way through. So yeah, and it can also be used, apart from long-standing psychological burdens and helping to slowly and gently clear those up, it can be used to help calm individuals down who fall too quickly and easily into emotional extremes. So someone who becomes angry too quickly, someone who becomes frustrated too quickly. But also on the opposite end of the emotional spectrum, someone who too easily falls into excessive worry and fear and self-doubt. Albizia contains acetylcholine, which is a vitally important and multifaceted neurotransmitter that's also found in the human nervous system, right? So this is, again, going back to this line that every human, like every plant and animal, is one of the infinitely many neurons in the nervous system of Gaia. So this is a perfect example of that. While albizia is not as widely utilized as some of the other well-known so-called mood elevating and antidepressant herbs, so St. John's wort, kava, I think that it's arguably the most effective and widely applicable botanical remedy that is available to us for working into this complex of psycho-emotional issues, and doesn't really have the same contraindications that St. John's wort and possibly kava have. In Chinese medicine, albizia is understood as a superior Shen tonic. So Shen is the spirit. So it's a calming spirit herb. And both the bark and the flowers are used, and the bark is said to anchor the spirit, the flowers to lighten the spirit. So that's albizia. I encourage anyone who's listening to this to take a look at the tree, because it's very beautiful. And it actually, it looks like, the flower looks like a kind of explosion of a neural net, like opening up into the cosmos. It's very beautiful. So Yulia Graves, she talks about the doctrine of signatures in relation to albizia, and she says, we will not be surprised to find that albizia, the mimosa family, are healing plants for nerves and sensitivity, and to know that these leaf movements occur from electrical impulses running through the plant tissue in quasi-nerve-like fashion. The Cherokee call the plant sensitive plant, or bashful. Sorry, they call the sensitive plant bashful. Sensitive plant is another name that's used. So it's used in formulas for people who are too shy. There's electrical impulses running through the plant tissue that cause movements of the flower and the leaf structure, which is really a really amazing signature for just showing. I mean, it might also be a signature for oversensitivity to EMF radiation and that sort of thing too. It would be something worth exploring, given how electrically charged this particular plant is. So that's one example.
Plants always have a variety of, so can we look at things like through a biological reductionism lens, where it's like, well, what does it contain, right? That creates this effect. But if one of those constituents, so, one of those chemicals within the plant is acetylcholine, that's already going to have vast network effects, because it's a neurotransmitter in our brain. So it actually just contains acetylcholine as is, by a biologically identical version of it. And so acetylcholine is it's like a neurotransmitter involved in concentration and focus and flow states. And so this is what we were talking about with, how technology robs us of our ability to enter into those states. It's like the acetylcholine person is like the kind of introverted person reading and focusing and creating art, attuned to nature, perhaps. And the acetylcholine also has a huge role in the enteric nervous system and digestion, and in creating the migrating motor complex, which is how we have bowel movements and how we move food throughout the digestive system. Now you see how, SIBO and IBS and this overgrowth of bad bacteria and all these issues that people have with their digestive systems, 60% of the population has some sort of digestive dysfunction. And a lot of that comes down to a dysfunction in the migrating motor complex, and so it's just like adding in albizia with that just one constituent could explain all of these effects that it has. And then another thing that's reading about albizia is a histamine stabilizer, and histamines it's involved in digestion and in the inflammatory allergic immune response, but it's also, histamine's also a neurotransmitter that creates agitation and anxiety and mania and hysteria, and may have a relationship with OCD like symptoms. Like, so all these things is like coming from, like, so you diagnose mental health conditions based on subjective information, and we don't often know what creates that or what causes that, but histamine is probably associated with a lot of these like hyperactive states, anxious and agitated states. So if you're stabilizing histamine and calming that response down, it's going to have a huge effect on mood.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. So, okay, what should we talk about now? Well, okay, let's consider how, so Green Anarchy is basically takes the position of anti-civilization. And so when you say to people like, oh, my political orientation is anti-civilization, anti-government, I mean, anti-government maybe some people can get behind, but anti-civilization, most people don't understand what that entails, right? So let's talk about the implications of civilization for global health and the so-called improvement of health, because we hear claims all the time about how, oh, thanks to civilization, we've been able to overcome all these diseases and so on and so on and so on, right? So people point to things like smallpox and polio. But then when you look at things like cancer, all kinds of mental health issues, immune deficiencies, genocides even, right? Because genocidal behavior is a product of civilization. You didn't have genocides before civilization. All of these things are products of basically the technological, the technopathocracy and the mediated hyper control society. And so Richard Grossinger is this kind of anthropologist who's really interested in homeopathy, and he writes about this issue. Maybe I'll just read a little bit from him. So he says that basically to say that there's a supposed global improvement of health and longevity with civilization, this violates holism fundamentally. So he says that from a homeopathic standpoint, social and economic problems are deemed the collective result of disease driven inward, right? And this is one of the implications of civilization, is that it drives disease inward. So he says, smallpox may turn into sociopathic behavior over generations of suppression masking as a cure. A palliative reduction of tuberculosis can lead to an increase in criminal activity. And then he cites this book that made the claim that there is a relationship between vaccination and social violence, right? So it's the question of the diseases of civilization, right? It's not just diabetes, which is commonly listed as the disease of civilization. It's many, many, many things.
How does civilization drive disease inward? Can you speak more on that, or
how does it drive disease inward? We'll have to get into homeopathic philosophy for that. But so we can go to Kant. Basically, Kant says that diseases operate by way of correspondence to the inner affections of the human being. And so a disease, a pathological manifestation, is simply an outward expression of one's interior state. And there's this great passage where he says, man hates his neighbor. He is willing to violate every commandment. Such is the state of man today. This state is represented in men's diseases. All diseases upon the earth, acute and chronic, are representations of man's internals. Otherwise, he would not be susceptible or could not develop that which is within him. The image of his own interior self comes out in disease. And I think that's a good explanation of what it means for disease to be driven inward. It goes back to this earlier discussion that we had about the image.
Right.
And in this homeopathic philosophy, at least as Ken represents it, basically we have to understand inner images if we are to understand how diseases are working. And these inner images, to understand the source of a lot of them, we have to think about this allergy to civilization itself, because that's where they're coming from.
Hmm. And it's this idea of like our body is a response to our environment. So if we're in a pathological environment, just repeating what we initially were talking about, there's going to be pathology driven within. That makes sense from that perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if we're not giving things enough time, like with the analogy of the garlic mustard, the example of garlic mustard, having like a long game, right? And if we examine that game within context of decades, it looks pathological. But garlic mustard has a balance that it achieves throughout a longer stretch of time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, since we're talking about, images, we can talk a little bit about like, okay, so what is the body, right? So it's a big question. What is the body? And I think it's useful to try and, yeah, this is where one of the things that I really value in Rudolf Steiner's work, we talked more about last time. But Steiner makes this threefold division in the body. He talks about the etheric body, which is basically the body of the life forces, the formative forces. The astral body, which is what provides sentience and consciousness. And the I organization, which is the self-aware, eternal, spiritual part of the human being. So when we're this is part of what we mean when we're talking about holistic treatment, right? So we have to understand at which level of the organism we're targeting, which level of the organism is a disease organism targeting when it's attacking a person. So Dennis Klocek talks about, since we're talking about homeopathy, he talks about how homeopathic remedies and flower essences work, and I thought it was a really beautiful explanation of why sometimes we need different medicines to address different problems, right? So herbs can work on one level of the organism, but they might not be enough. They might not be sufficient. Osteopathic adjustment might be able to work on one level, one layer, one persona, but it might not be enough. So we have to understand the human being as, not only a threefold division of the body, but also a kind of infinitary level of different personas, different levels, different layers. And we have to understand how we can target the level or the layer that is in need of treatment. And sometimes it's the case where you basically are able to precisely target the level or the layer, the persona that's being affected, and it has a ripple effect and affects all the others, and you have a miraculous cure. But more often than not, that's not the case, right? And you have to kind of approach things layer by level. So you're able to address one problem. So you address a digestive issue in a patient, but then you have to go on and work on a psychological issue, and it requires different treatment strategies, and it takes time to unfold. So when we're talking about homeopathic remedies and flower essences, I'm going to read from Klocek. He says, homeopathic remedies and flower essences are forces in the suprasensory realm of the ethers, and the elements that result in a remedy that allows the soul to connect with pictures of why things are happening. This is very different from pathology and pharmacology aimed at eliminating organisms, because one gets rid of organisms while the state of the organism is unchanged. Basically, working with pictures, which is the same thing that Kent was saying, right? About disease as a representation of a person's internals. And basically, there's a kind of retuning that happens, a retuning that takes place between the, what can we say? So a well-indicated homeopathic remedy or well-indicated flower essence provides the etheric body, which, according to Steiner, doesn't get sick. It's the body, it's the life body, it's the body of formative forces. So a well-indicated remedy provides the etheric body with images, and images are what inform the vital body of how there is a miscommunication between the I and the astral body. And it's this miscommunication between the I and the astral body which causes disease. And so when the etheric body receives an image, it can see why a given illness has arisen, and it can initiate the self-healing process.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Yeah, I think it's hard for me with Steiner because he has terms for things that maybe they're not completely described by other terms, but it's like the etheric body, maybe it's like chi or vis, the astral body, maybe consciousness and the eye organizations, like
Yeah, it's not totally the same.
yeah, so it's difficult, but so yeah, he's like got distinct descriptions, or he's referring to distinct things that are different from other philosophies. But it's actually, that's so interesting. I mean, because we talk about plants and the energetic state of plants, which is captured in homeopathy and flower essences, but also in the whole plant tincture, whole plant remedies, in food even, as you know, like the plants evolving and responding to environmental conditions that they're then communicating and transferring onto us in a similar way. As the plant's dealing with certain struggles in the environment,
Yeah.
and has adapted to those struggles, and is like kind of sending that message on, especially if you think of how the environment or society might be sick. The body may not be attuned to those imbalances in the environment, whereas maybe the plant, who exists outside of society in some way, is able to kind of communicate that, or maybe is more attuned to that imbalance.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. As
So,
we talk about that with homeopathy, and in school, it was sort of communicated as the homeopathic aggravates the disease state, right? So the law of similars is that you're providing a remedy that creates the same symptoms, the same disease symptoms in a healthy individual, and then by giving that remedy to somebody who's exhibiting those symptoms as a disease process, it's sort of like alerting the body to what's going on. It's aggravating it potentially, so that to activate our own internal healing mechanisms.
Yeah, and so so basically, to put it in the language of anthroposophical medicine, it would basically say that homeopathic remedy is feeding the etheric body or the vital body with images that then initiate the process of self-healing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very, very interesting stuff. Where should we go with the conversation now? Well, I mean, since we're talking about homeopathy, I mean, we can talk a little bit about the history of medicine and how, medicine has been handed over, to basically state licensed doctors and officials. This wasn't always the case. And in fact, the American Medical Association arose in the 19th century as a result of allopathics, the allopathic doctors' fear of homeopathy. And, it's a little known history, but homeopathy in 19th century America was immensely successful and immensely popular and immensely widespread. I mean, there were dozens of homeopathic hospitals throughout the United States.
It's regarded like right now with a lot of disdain in the skeptic consciousness, right?
Yeah. It's attacked maybe more than any other modality.
Right, definitely.
It wasn't always the case. But there's a similar history of, so the AMA emerging as a result of the threat of homeopathic medicine. And, this is a time when allopathic doctors were giving patients mercury, and patients were dying and getting sick as a result of allopathic treatment, which of course is still happening, because the iatrogenic death is the third leading cause of death in America.
Yeah, and that is like, it's not the misprescribing; it's accurate and responsible prescribing.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a long history, and there's been a great deal of persecution, even amongst herbalists and people working with plants. The story is the same. Is the same. It's a story of a state licensed monopoly coming in and trying to take away power from people who basically are working with healing systems that give both the healer and the patient a sense of autonomy and freedom back. And, allopathic medicine just doesn't do that. It's not concerned with giving the patient freedom. It's not concerned with teaching the patient things that they didn't know, or that they could do for themselves to help to increase the vitality of to help increase the vitality of their own organism, right? So they're not given these tools that after treatment they can then rely on to help build and maintain resiliency, right? But a holistic practice that doesn't do that is not holistic, right? It's an integral part. You have to give the patient tools that they can use, so that they understand the patterns of living and the patterns of thinking and the patterns of feeling that brought them to the place where they were sick and needed to seek out help in the first place.
It's like helping with that process of self-understanding and body awareness, all these like other terms we have for that, empowerment. And
Yeah.
informed consent is a big topic right now, because people have the experience of things being done to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So medications being sort of, I don't know what this bottle is. It's just a bunch of pills. I take it every day. And then there's this complete disconnect between the remedy, let's say, and the person,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the disempowerment that results from that, right? So it's like, you need surgery for this. And it's like, okay, if I don't do it, you're telling me I'm going to die. It takes
Yeah.
all of my power away. And my entire sense of integrity and well-being is being outsourced to this other person.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And basically it's thinking of disease as pathology, right?
Yeah.
And disease is not, we can't just think of disease in terms of pathology. I mean, we have to, this is why it's important to do intakes, like proper intakes, right? You can't just throw herbs at someone who comes in and says, I'm depressed. Like healing has to consider basically everything from the time of conception to the time of death. Like that's the scope. Right?
And outside of that too, the preconception and the
Right.
and the
Right.
ancestral sort of epigenetic things that get passed on. Yeah.
Right. So, okay. Yeah, I want to read maybe a bit of a longer quote here from Freddie Perlman, who's another anti-civilization writer, where he's talking about basically the medical mafia, medical monopoly emerging. And I think that the picture that he paints here is really good and kind of maybe helps to tie in the position of green anarchy and medicine that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. So he says the so-called witches, heiresses to the informally transmitted knowledge of herbs and illnesses, are known to be healers, whereas the doctors, capital D, notoriously ignorant of all this lore, are intent on establishing a state-licensed monopoly over illness so as to police the sick. The doctors will eventually appropriate some of the herbal knowledge of the exterminated witches, but the healing will always be incidental to the policing. They will persecute illnesses even if they have to turn human beings to vegetables or cut them to shreds. Medicine is only one of the human domains over which the state-licensed masters and doctors established their monopoly. In every domain, human talents and powers are transformed into powers wielded by a police. Everything people did for themselves comes to be done against them by the Leviathan's licensed agents. Human beings, as well as the biosphere, fall under continual police surveillance. And just look outside. Look what's happening around us right now. Powers wielded by living beings to enhance their lives are appropriated by a dead thing, the almighty edifice, Leviathan. And Leviathan does not use its policing to enhance life, but only to further enhance its policing powers, to fatten the artifice, to enlarge the realm of the dead. Leviathan's licensed agents even move to expropriate radical visionaries of their memory of human freedom, kinship, and community. So he goes on, but this is, I think, a perfect summation of what we were talking about in terms of, the technopathocratic civilization removing autonomy from medicine, and it's the same story with homeopathy. It's the same story with herbal medicine. It's the same story with basically every modality that the state doesn't accept as legitimate. They'll do everything that they can to just throw it away, and not only throw it away, but demonize it and vilify it to the point now where a practice that was widely accepted in the 19th century America is now thought to be just complete and utter nonsense.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of shame around those who directed at those who practice it or those who use it, and this marginalization of those practices, sort of like, or now it's being deemed like complementary medicine, right? Integrative, right. Where you're not, and I think there's a lot of things in that quote, right? He's talking about the perpetuation of the system for the sick. Power begets power. That the system is in place to generate more power for itself. And then how that's not necessarily with our best interest in mind, but we're being told that it is. It's like, this is for your own good, and how these things emerge from, it has to emerge from an authoritative system. So there's actually a great article about authoritarianism in medicine in the way that we're trained, right? So there are definitely hierarchies in the training system, and then the way that that's transferred onto patients. where they're being told, again, like what I've already said, like they're being told what's going to happen to them as if there's no other option.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if maybe that's enough. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah. What else do you have any other notes, or what else would you like to say about that?
Well, I mean, I have lots of notes, but I think that maybe yeah, maybe we should wrap it up there, and if you'll have me on again, we can talk some more. Yeah.
I mean, what are my last question I want to leave off with? Maybe what are the ways in which we can? I mean, so a lot of things that are being proposed, and we're talking about the sickness of society or civilization. We're talking about eradicating, doing away with computers. There's obviously the irony of us being in front of a computer right now.
Well, no, of course, but we have no choice. We have no choice. There's no other option right now.
What would moving away from this addiction to civilization or from this pathology look like? Like what, we mentioned herbal medicine, homeopathy as healing modalities.
Yeah, so those are tools. Those are tools, and there's not a single answer, right? So people can come up with different kinds of solutions, but I think that fundamentally it all comes down to asking the question: well, a given technology works, but is it good? And starting to realize again that technology is not neutral, that there are moral directives and imperatives within the technological system, or rather we can say anti-moral imperatives, because it's not oriented toward the good. It's not a genuine morality. It's an orientation towards the acceptance and the embrace of a pathology as the new normal. So what does it look like? Well, that's the task, is to try and find experimental ways of forging a path forward. And it can't be done through the imposition of more technology, right? Because even people who say, oh well, we just need to move to solar power and wind and so on and so on. Well, but if all this so-called green energy is going to do is just perpetuate the same system, what use is it? What use is it? Not to even get into the discussion about how the alternative energy sources that are labeled green are not actually all that green when you start looking at the ecological impact that they have. So what do we do? I mean, I don't know. I'm doing what I can, working with herbs. That's my path. But there are many things that can be done, right? There are many things that can be done, and we need people to start working together and start having conversations about about how to move forward. And it is happening. It is happening. But the slant that I take on it is that it has to be outside of the technopathocratic system. And I'd like to see a new Luddite movement emerge in the Western culture, because right now people are afraid of it and they think you're crazy if you bring it up. But I hope that this conversation has at least opened up the possibility of considering the idea as a legitimate one.
Yeah, and I think it paints a picture of herbal medicine as different from just like an alternative to medication. It's a completely different thing with a completely different underlying set of morals and philosophy. And actually, I have a question about, so technology, when we're aware of how it's moving us away from beauty and the good and truth, and we just add more technology to try and move us closer, and then that just moves us further away. I mean, yeah, like how are we able to disentangle ourselves from all of it, right? So it's like, I mean, we're creating a podcast episode to discuss this.
Yeah, I know.
We're doing more of a reliance on it. And I mean, are there communities that you're aware of that have gone back to some of these more like primal, like we talk like, there's this whole like primal movement, but it's still within the same philosophy, like people eating like paleo cookies and stuff.
Yeah, still relies upon money, still relies upon capitalist economic system. And this is the thing, the system has become so totalizing that even indigenous communities who were formerly able to supply all of their food, all of their resources for themselves. We're completely self-sustaining. Many of these communities have lost their autonomy and now are dependent upon agriculturally grown produce, and that was never the case for a lot of these communities. And you have companies like Monsanto now who are going over, pesticides and herbicide sprays intentionally, and spraying these poisons over ecosystems of people who refuse to be a part of the social system, refuse to be a part of civilization, as a way of making them dependent. So this is how perverse it's become, where if you want to be outside of civilization will try and make it so that you're dependent upon the structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole topic there with the reliance on these patented seeds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how that, if you don't want to buy into our patent, then we're just going to spray the poison that these seeds are supposedly resistant to, so that you actually have to have them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there is a lot of potential. So I don't want to paint the picture as an entirely pessimistic and nihilistic one, right? So the Green Anarchy movement is not about just throwing our hands up in the air and saying, oh, there's nothing we can do, right? So yeah, so I want to go back maybe to the beginning of the discussion, where Zerzan talks about medicine as the restoration of what belongs to nature, and healing as the removing of whatever works against life's wonderful capacity to renew itself, right? Because life, the vital force, is stronger and more intelligent than any civilization that we can come up with. And that's the bottom line, and that's the source of anything that we can call hope today, is going back to this fundamental insight.
Maybe civilization is garlic mustard, and and there's a greater plan over the next millennia to like slowly move towards some sort of balance that we're just unaware of.
Well, we'll see. We'll see how things go.
Thank you, Victor, for joining
my
me.
pleasure.
So I'm gonna have links on the webinars that you're giving related to herbal medicine, that people can check those out. That'd
be great. Yeah, so it's me and so it's a panel of 5 herbalists, and it's called Herbalists and Herbs. And yeah, starting in September, we're going to do a series of webinars on various topics related to herbal medicine. And if you're interested, we already have several webinars that we've done, some of which are up on YouTube. So we can, have a link to my website, but also a link to the YouTube channel where these webinars are at too.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll put all the links in the show notes for everyone to check them out.
Great.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.